Hello and welcome to the Faces of Africa Pocket Edition, where we dissect and discuss the topics covered in our weekly documentary show, which takes you through the continent's history, cultures, and major issues through exploring great personalities. This week on Faces of Africa podcast, we're taking a look at the life of the founding father of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda. My name is Fathiya Nur, and I have here
Kabinda Lemba.
Hi, Kabinda.
Hey, Fathiya.
Tell us a bit who you are. We don't know you yet.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Who am I? So I am a filmmaker. I basically work in all genres, and one of my favorite ones is documentaries because I'm a history buff, and so I love telling stories because I think stories have a way of just really letting you know where we're from, where we're going, what we can do differently,
right,
and what has worked.
For sure. Yeah. I think watching that documentary on Kenneth Kaunda, you really see him sort of like 360. Mm-hmm. But I want you to tell me your experience, producing and directing it. Tell me about it.
Okay, so I live in Kenya. I'm originally from Zambia. I grew up knowing him as the father of the nation. As fate would have it, when we got in touch with him, it was towards the celebration of his 88th birthday. Wow. So I thought, you know what, in celebrating this birthday, in celebrating this life, let's try and sort of make that the thread that we will go, we will weave throughout the story. Yeah. And that's basically what we did.
Watching the documentary, you actually see that part of his birthday. And I thought one thing that was so interesting, just watching almost every part where you see Kaunda, he's always standing up, running a little bit.
Yes.
Like sort of trying to prove that he's still
strong. He still got it. Yeah, he was that type of an individual. So I think him doing that was always speaking to that sporty side of him. Growing up, when you had certain international matches or even just like local friendly matches, he would either be the ref in those soccer matches, or you would have him sort of like do a kickoff. So he was very sporty. He loved his golf, but of course, Zambians by default, you're born, it's like football is in your DNA. So he would do that sort of thing, and he lived a very, I think we touched on it, but not too much. He was very watchful about what he ate and his health and so forth. So he was a vegetarian for a very, very long time. So I think even that ability at 88 to still be able to run, but it used to be funny because you would see the security guys having these faces like, don't fall, don't
take it slow.
He never did, as much as I can remember. But he was a lot of things, and I think that is something that would be nice for us to sort of take back, that we don't have to be one thing. We can be many, successful at whichever ones or one, but let's still be, like a whole-rounded individual.
How interesting is that? For me as a Kenyan, Kenneth Kaunda, I would read his story in our history books. And he would just be a name in the book. But I think watching the documentary, you understand he was a key figure for a lot of Zambians.
Absolutely.
And you see a lot of them who were young at the time, they talk about the handkerchief. And his big smile. Did you experience that?
Absolutely. So I had the benefit of growing up in a neighborhood called Avondale, which is near our international airport. So anytime he would be returning from some state visit that he had made, he would always do the thing of, the motorcade is coming, we would see it on TV, so we would time it to say, okay, he's about to leave the airport, let's run to the road. So we would run to the road, and usually you might not even see his face, but you'd see the hand and the handkerchief. And we actually spoke about it, and he basically used it as sort of a symbol for peace, white being a color associated with peace. And so, it's him sort of, waving and sort of flying that white flag of peace.
But how was life under him when it came to, like politics and his policies in the country? How was it?
Okay. Like most of the young African nations, it started off, with what we like to call the golden age. We got independence from the British, then we're sort of figuring out how politics should go. So for the first about 10 years in Zambia, there was more than one political party. And then as time went by in the early 70s, he then clamped down and said, with of course support from people within the party and from other sectors, they said, we're going to go one-party state. And I think the reason at that particular time was the feeling was that there were people who were in opposition, but they were not just in opposition to him, but the feeling was that they were in opposition to self-rule by Zambians. So a lot was done in the way of declarations and referendums to sort of clamp down on the opposition. By the time I was being born, I was born 11 years, I was born in 1980, so it was 11 years to him leaving power. So by the time I was born, we just knew it's Kaunda and this is it. So, I mean, from what I know, the early years were good, but there were a couple of factors that also came in that made it kind of difficult. There was the copper prices during the 70s that went really low, and Zambia was very dependent on copper. So that meant that our economy, suffered a lot because of that dependence on copper as our main produce. There was also the fact that majority of the countries around us at that particular time, that being Namibia, Zimbabwe, Angola, Mozambique, were either at civil war or were still under, colonial powers. So that in its sense of us being surrounded by a majority of either, countries that were still colonized or countries that were politically unstable, also had an impact on the way that things were running in Zambia.
And is this where now the next president comes in?
Frederick Chiluba. So what basically happened is in the late 80s, it had begun to happen. We were experiencing drought just as we are now, nothing new. And there were food shortages because of the drought, but there were also food shortages because of just the way they were managing the economy. Zambia's staple food is mealie meal, maize meal, unga. So there were shortages. There were a lot of shortages that were happening in the late 80s and early 90s where people would have to queue for long lines to sort of, go to your shop and hope and pray that it would have what you needed. So in mid 1990 and early 1991, there was a massive food riot that happened across the country. People were rioting because there wasn't enough food. And those riots went on for days. Despite of how his leadership had gone throughout the years, I think still at his core was that aspect of, the people.
Generally, just even listening to you, it means that, Kaunda had such a strong impact, positive to a lot of the people.
Absolutely.
But I want us to talk about this particular instance where I think what he did was quite big when HIV/AIDS was big at the time around Africa, around the world. And his son passed in 1986 and he came publicly and talked about it. How was that situation?
Zambia was hit hard by the AIDS pandemic, and a lot of, as it goes, in a lot of African countries, there was this whole thing of, okay, is this something that we should be ashamed about? Because at that particular time, the narrative globally was that anybody who's getting AIDS is definitely, promiscuous and living a life that is not right. And so there were a lot of people. We lost a very, very large portion of our youth at that particular time. And I remember even growing up, there were funerals all around. And so that really helped, the nation come to terms with, to say, this is what we're fighting. And he did become, one of the very vocal, voices about, how we need to protect ourselves from, the scourge that it was and what it was doing to the nation. But I love the fact that he was not your typical African strongman. He would show weakness because in that weakness, it would lead to strength. And it was strength for his people.
Definitely. I mean, even the name of the documentary is The Man of the Big Heart. It explains a lot what we've talked about. But just to wrap up our discussion here, on a positive note, he was sort of like a fashionista,
He was.
The Kaunda suits. And it has actually had an impact in Africa, right?
I was very shocked when I came here to hear that name of of the Kaunda suit. And he tells a story about it in the documentary, which is very interesting, about Nyerere telling him to say, my guy, you're selling in Kenya. And he says it, he says, I think they called it the Kaunda suit so that I wouldn't go after them and want to make money and be angry. Yeah. But he was stylish. Yeah. He was stylish. Yeah. Before the Kaunda suit as well, during the independence struggles and so forth, I forget what you call it, but I think it's the kente cloth from Ghana.
Yes, kente.
So they all used to wear that kente cloth, him and Nyerere and so forth. Mm-hmm. Then when politics came, it was a suit, but at some point, the safari suit, which then became the Kaunda suit, became his style.
Yeah. Wow. So interesting. Thank you so much for making time. I think I've learned a lot myself.